Nobody thinks about what happens between stops. People think about arrivals. They think about doors opening, crowds spilling out, the little rush of being late. They think about the platform number and the coffee they shouldn't have bought, and the meeting that's going to start whether they're there or not. They don't think about the stretch of track where there are no windows worth looking out of, where the train is just a metal hallway sliding through darkness and old concrete. Between stops feels like a pause the world doesn't bother recording. That's where Caleb Vance disappeared. Not at a station, not under bright cameras, not with a scream that made everyone turn their heads. He vanished inside a moving commuter train on an ordinary weekday morning, on a route so routine it had its own rhythm of yawns and headphone leaks and quiet scrolling. The North Line ran the same way every day, like a habit the city couldn't quit. It cut through office districts and older industrial blocks, past brick walls stained with decades of rain. It slipped under bridges where you could see rust patterns shaped like maps. It passed a trench-like stretch locals called the Cut, an ugly corridor of concrete and chain link where the train felt briefly buried. The Cut was the kind of place you stared at for half a second and then forgot. Caleb was 29, the sort of person who looked like he belonged in the crowd, which is exactly why he vanished so cleanly. He worked in logistics operations, which meant he lived on calendars and constraints and the constant quiet pressure of things needing to arrive on time. He wasn't famous. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't the kind of guy who made enemies loudly. If he had a superpower, it was reliability. He texted back. He showed up. He brought his own charger. He kept a spare transit card in his wallet because once, years ago, he'd been stuck at a gate with a dead one, and he'd decided never again. His sister Rowan teased him for it. Not cruelly, more like the way an older sibling says, "Look at you, Mr. Responsible," while also secretly being grateful someone in the family had their head screwed on straight. Rowan and Caleb had a Tuesday thing. Nothing glamorous. He'd stop by her place early, they'd eat toast and complain about adulthood, and then he'd head downtown. It was comforting because it was boring. It was the kind of tradition you don't realize you depend on until it breaks that morning. The tradition broke quietly. Caleb left his apartment with damp hair and a half-zipped backpack because he'd overslept by just enough to make everything feel slightly rushed. He wore a gray hoodie under a navy jacket, and he carried the kind of calm people mistake for being unbothered. He wasn't unbothered, he was simply practiced at moving. He reached Marrowgate Station with a minute to spare, tapped through the gates, and got on the train with the same unconscious confidence everyone has when they've done something 100 times. There were witnesses. Later. Always witnesses, though nobody knows they're witnesses at the time. A woman with a red scarf remembered him because he offered his seat to an older man and then stood near the door, one hand on the pole, eyes on his phone. A teenager remembered a guy with a dark backpack and a wedding band tan line on his finger. A man in a suit remembered the sound of someone's zipper snagging and then being yanked free. Small details, nothing heroic, nothing cinematic. Caleb sent a quick message to his girlfriend Elise. 2 words, casual as breathing. On train. Elise didn't respond right away. She was already in work mode, juggling emails, half listening to a morning briefing. She saw the message, smiled faintly, and assumed she'd reply later. That assumption would become a bruise that never quite stopped aching. The train rolled out of Marrowgate and picked up speed. It clacked over track joints and slid past the outer neighborhoods where people's lives still had porches and lawns. Inside the cars, the mood was the usual commuter hush, an unspoken agreement that everyone would pretend not to exist. Then the North Line entered the cut. You could feel it before you saw it. A subtle shift in sound. The outside noise dropped away, replaced by a lower, denser rumble. The windows framed brick walls close enough to touch. Graffiti passed like fast subtitles you couldn't read. The lights flickered once, not enough to panic anyone, just enough to remind you the train wasn't a living room. It was a machine. And somewhere in that stretch, somewhere between one station and the next, Caleb disappeared. He did not step onto a platform. He did not appear in a clear camera shot walking out of a station. He did not use his transit card again, but his backpack remained. When the train reached end of line later that morning, a conductor walked through the cars, doing the quick scan for forgotten umbrellas, empty cups, the occasional sleeping passenger who missed their stop and woke up embarrassed. He saw a backpack near the door of the second car. It wasn't tossed or kicked under a seat. It sat upright, strap loops tidy, like someone had placed it down carefully. He opened it only because protocol said to check for valuables and identify the owner. Inside, a laptop, a work badge, a water bottle, a wallet with Caleb's ID and bank cards. Normal things. The kind of things you do not abandon if you're choosing to leave quietly. Caleb's phone, however, was not in the backpack. That missing detail turned the whole scene into a question mark. Because people don't usually walk away from a wallet and laptop unless something has gone wrong, and they don't usually keep only their phone unless the phone is the one thing they needed in a hurry, or the one thing someone else needed to take. Rowan called Caleb that morning because he missed their Tuesday stop. She wasn't worried at first. She was mildly annoyed, the way you get when someone breaks routine without warning. The first call went to voicemail. The second call also went to voicemail. She texted him a joke about him getting kidnapped by his own calendar. No response. Then she called Elise. Elise answered, distracted. Rowan asked a simple question. Did he make it in? Elise paused, then said Caleb had texted on train, and she assumed he was already at the office. That pause on the phone, the one where both of them stopped breathing properly for a second, was the moment the day split into before and after. By late morning, Rowan was at Marrowgate Station, standing at the customer service window with a face that made people step back politely. The employee behind the glass looked tired in that special way transit employees look when they're about to be blamed for something they didn't personally do. Rowan described Caleb. She said he boarded the morning train and never showed up. The employee's eyes changed. The employee said there had been an incident. Rowan hated that word immediately. Incident sounded like a delay, like spilled coffee, like a broken escalator. This was her brother. The employee said transit security had recovered a backpack. Rowan's legs went soft. Within an hour, city police were involved. A detective named Lila Hart took the call because Lila had a reputation for sticking with the ugly cases long after other people started calling them unfortunate mysteries. Lila met Rowan at the station and listened. She asked the usual questions: mental health, debts, relationship issues, because you ask them even when they feel insulting. People vanish for complicated reasons. But as Rowan answered, Lila watched her face and heard something beneath the words. Rowan wasn't performing panic. She was confused. Confusion is honest. Lila requested footage from station cameras. Marrowgate showed Caleb entering the gates and boarding. The next station showed people exiting, but no Caleb. Another station, the same. The cameras were good at platforms and entrances. They were useless inside the moving cars. The North Line didn't have proper interior coverage. A few low-quality lenses near doors, mostly for vandalism reports and blind spots everywhere. So the investigation collapsed into one maddening question. Where can a person go on a moving train? The public, as always, supplied theories faster than evidence. He jumped. He fell. He ran off with someone. He got off at the wrong stop. He staged it. Lila listened to all of it and wrote almost nothing down. She focused on what she could prove. Caleb's backpack was found on the train. Caleb's phone was missing. Caleb had sent a message shortly after boarding. Caleb never used his transit card again. And then there was the geography. Between Marrowgate and the next major stop, the train passed the cut. Along the cut ran a maintenance corridor behind a fence, and behind that fence, if you knew where to look, was a metal service door built into the wall. Transit workers called the tunnel behind it the Gray Run. Most commuters had no idea it existed. Lila asked for schematics. The rail company stalled in the way big systems stall when a request feels dangerous. They said safety protocols. They said proprietary infrastructure. They said paperwork. They offered platitudes like bandages. Lila did not accept bandages. She filed formal requests. She pushed. She reminded them, politely at first, that a person had vanished in their care. Polite pressure is still pressure when it's backed by a badge. A maintenance supervisor named Troy Gann met her for the first walk to the service door. Troy wore a high-visibility vest over a hoodie and had the posture of someone used to giving tours he didn't want to give. He spoke in rehearsed sentences like he was reciting policy. The tunnel is always locked. Only authorized personnel can enter. There's no way a passenger could access it. Lila didn't argue. She listened. At the service door, she knelt and studied the concrete at the base. It was gritty, stained, old, and there were scuff marks, not dramatic footprints, not a clear trail, just subtle abrasions like someone had stood there repeatedly, shifting weight. Troy shrugged and said, "Workers came through there all the time." Lila asked for access logs. Troy said they were stored digitally at headquarters. Lila asked if there had been entry that morning. Troy hesitated half a beat, then said he didn't know. That half beat lodged in Lila's mind like grit under a fingernail. Still, the tunnel wasn't opened right then. Safety teams needed to clear it. The company insisted on protocols. Lila, stretched thin by urgent missing person hours, focused on surface searches and station canvassing and interviewing commuters from that train. Days passed. Rowan and Elise lived in a loop of repeating questions. They replayed the morning. They debated whether Caleb might have switched cars, whether he might have sat somewhere hidden, whether he might have gotten off and lost his phone and not been able to call. Hope is inventive. It will build you 100 little stories if the alternative is a cliff. Search efforts expanded. Posters went up. Caleb's photo appeared on local news. The rail company issued a cautious statement expressing concern and reminding riders to report suspicious activity. Suspicious activity between stops on a packed commuter line. That line alone made Rowan feel like she might snap. Lila pushed harder on the tunnel theory because the tunnel was the only place that made sense of the between stops problem. But each time she pressed, she hit the same resistance. It's locked, it's secure, it's impossible. Impossible is a word investigators learn to distrust. Lila got Caleb's Rail app data with legal requests. It took too long, because everything takes too long when you're trying to catch a mystery while it's still warm. When she finally saw the data, one small detail sharpened the timeline without using a single, precise minute. Caleb had interacted with a service alert shortly before the train entered the cut. That meant he was awake and using his phone near the moment he vanished. He didn't disappear in a sleepy blur. He was alert. Lila returned to the cut with a different team. Crime scene techs, a transit safety officer, documentation equipment, more authority, less patience. They examined the scuff marks again. They measured spacing and angles. The pattern suggested two bodies close to the door, not one. It looked like one person had been held near the entrance, while another manipulated the lock area. Lila asked for the logs again. This time she demanded them in writing. The rail company finally produced an entry record. The service door had been accessed that morning by an authorized badge, a contractor badge, not a long-term employee, not a familiar name. The log listed a single initial and a surname, Merritt. When Lila asked Troy about Merritt, Troy's answer came too fast. Temporary contractor, not on payroll anymore, didn't have contact info. People say things like that when they're trying to make someone evaporate. Lila tried to find Merritt anyway. She hit dead ends, a disconnected number, an address that belonged to a rental property with new tenants who'd never heard the name, a contracting agency that claimed it had no record, then admitted quietly that it had, once, a short-term worker by that name, but the file was incomplete. Incomplete. Another word investigators learned to hate. Weeks turned into months. The case cooled. Not solved, not closed. Just cooled in the way a hot kettle cools when you walk away from it. Still dangerous if you touch it, but no longer screaming with steam. Rowan refused to accept that cooling. She wrote letters. She called city offices. She attended rail board meetings and sat in the back with a folder of documents like a quiet threat. Elise tried to keep a job while living in a grief that never finished. She kept Caleb's last message pinned at the top of her phone. On train. Lila stayed on the case, but she was one detective in a city that produced new crises daily. She pushed when she could. She waited when she had to. She collected quiet pieces and tried not to let them slip through her fingers. And then, almost 2 years later, the case moved again. Not because of a confession, not because of a dramatic tip line call, not because someone suddenly grew a conscience, because of a leak. A drainage problem under the cut had been causing subtle track issues, nothing spectacular, just enough to be unsafe if ignored. The rail company scheduled maintenance for the gray run, real maintenance, not a routine check that lasted 5 minutes on paper. A crew arrived early with equipment, flashlights, and keys. They unlocked the service door and stepped into the tunnel. The air inside was unexpectedly dry, like a sealed closet. Dust lay in soft layers along the floor. The concrete walls carried old water stains, but the tunnel itself felt preserved, strangely undisturbed. They walked deeper. At a junction, one worker's flashlight caught a small, dark object on the floor. A phone. It lay face down, half buried in dust, as if it had been dropped and time had politely covered it. The worker picked it up carefully. The case was scratched. The screen was dead. But on the back was a small emergency contact label. Something simple, the kind you put on a device in case you lose it. Rowan's name. The worker didn't know Rowan, but he knew what that meant. Phones don't sit undisturbed in a tunnel for years unless someone wanted them there. Unless the tunnel wasn't accessed, unless it was accessed and the phone was ignored. The supervisor made the calls. Transit security arrived. Then city police. Lila Hart got the message and felt her whole body tense with that sharp, sick hope investigators get when a long dead lead suddenly twitches. She drove to the cut and walked into the tunnel. She stood where the phone had been found and looked around like she was seeing the gray run for the first time. She noticed things that didn't belong. One of the concrete wall panels looked slightly cleaner than the surrounding structure. The bolts were newer. The paint tone was a fraction off. It wasn't obvious to casual eyes, but it glared at an investigator's brain like a wrong note. Maintenance workers said it had always been there. Lila asked them to unbolt it anyway. The workers grumbled because it wasn't on their work order. But a detective with a face like Lila's doesn't get ignored easily, not when she's holding the weight of a missing person case. They loosened the bolts. The panel shifted outward with a reluctant groan. Behind it was not wiring. Behind it was a narrow passage, a tunnel inside the tunnel, a forgotten service channel, the kind of old infrastructure hides like a secret nerve. The air that came out of that passage smelled different. Faintly chemical, faintly stale, like old plastic and disinfectant. Lila shone her flashlight in. The passage was cramped and ended at a heavy interior hatch secured with a padlock. The padlock looked old at first glance, but the rust was surface level. The kind of rust you get when someone wants something to look old quickly. The kind of rust that tells you the lock has been replaced. Lila didn't say cut it like an order. She said it softly because she didn't want the moment to shatter under its own weight. The lock was cut. The hatch opened. Inside was a small chamber, concrete on all sides, low ceiling, no windows. A space that felt less like a maintenance area and more like a holding closet someone built for the wrong purpose. There were items on the floor. A commuter jacket, a transit card, a watch, a torn backpack strap, a few personal objects arranged with an unsettling neatness, like someone had staged them as a cruel inventory. Near the back wall was a small plastic bag, the kind used for evidence collection, sealed carefully. Inside, it was a folded sheet of paper. Lila opened it with gloved hands. It was a note, written in blocky, deliberate handwriting, not a diary entry, not a confession, not even a plea, a sentence. Between stops is where they do it. Rowan heard those words later and said it felt like the floor shifted under her, as if the city itself was suddenly unreliable. Because they meant more than one person. They meant a method, a pattern, a system. Something practiced. Lila treated the chamber like a crime scene, because it was. She photographed everything. She bagged items. She sent the phone to digital forensics, even though it had been dead for years. She requested every badge log that ever touched the service door. The rail company, faced with physical evidence now, couldn't hide behind policy as easily. They produced contractor files, schedules, security reports, maintenance access records. The paper flood was meant to overwhelm. Lila read it anyway. The badge that opened the service door the morning Caleb disappeared was logged under the same name she'd heard years ago, Merritt. The file identified him as Darren Merritt, short-term contractor. Start date, a few months before Caleb vanished. End date, shortly after. Reason, completed assignment. Lila went looking for Darren again. This time, she found something she hadn't found before, a payroll trail. Even disappearing people leave footprints in money. The contracting company's payments had gone into an account that still existed. That account had transfers to another account under a name Lila recognized instantly. Troy Gann, the maintenance supervisor, the man who told her the tunnel was impossible for passengers to access, the man who'd spoken too fast and avoided logs. The man whose eyes had moved too much. Lila interviewed Troy the next day. He tried to keep his posture casual. He tried to act annoyed, like a man inconvenienced by nonsense. He said he didn't handle contractor payments personally. He said it must have been reimbursement for materials. He said lots of contractors used personal accounts temporarily because bureaucracy. Lila didn't argue. She asked questions that forced specifics. Why was the hidden passage bolted with newer hardware? Who authorized replacing the interior lock? Why did the badge log show access at times that didn't match maintenance tasks? Why did a contractor's payment route through his account? Troy's answers grew thinner, then brittle. The story he tried to hold together had too many seams. And when a story has seams, investigators pull. Under pressure, Troy admitted he knew about the hidden passage. He claimed it was an old utility channel used for storage and safety. He claimed it had been sealed because of vandalism risks. He claimed the padlock replacement was routine. Routine. Another word. Then Lila asked him the question that felt almost unfair in its simplicity. If it was routine, why wasn't it on the official schematics? Troy stared at her. His silence lasted too long. That's how it started to crack. Over the next weeks, Lila did what real investigations do. Not one dramatic move, but dozens of quiet, grinding ones. She pulled phone records. She tracked badge access patterns. She canvassed old maintenance staff. She found a retired signal technician who said the gray run had quirks and old sections nobody talked about. He said the hidden passage had been sealed after an incident years earlier, not documented properly because the rail company didn't want attention on it. He also said something else that turned Lila's spine cold. He said there had been other disappearances tied to the North Line over the years. People who didn't come home. People assumed to have walked away, or gotten lost, or chosen to vanish. People whose cases went quiet, fast. Lila reopened those files. She found patterns. Not perfect patterns. Life is messy, but enough. Late commuters, passengers traveling alone, disappearances in stretches where cameras were weak, reports of maintenance activity that didn't match schedules. She realized the cut wasn't just ugly, it was convenient. The public story remained simple. A missing commuter. A tragedy. A mystery. The private story, the one that began forming in Lila's mind, was uglier. A small group of people with access had learned how to use the gray spaces of the system. The moments between stations, the maintenance corridors, the unmonitored corners, to move someone out of a public place without causing a public scene. Not every disappearance would be the same. Not every case would be explainable. But the method existed. The chamber proved it. Now the question shifted again. Not where did Caleb go, but why Caleb? Rowan wanted that answer with a kind of hunger that scared her sometimes. If she could explain why, she could make it logical. If she could make it logical, it would hurt less, or so her mind insisted. But Lila, careful, didn't promise reasons. She focused on evidence. She focused on the chain. The phone in the tunnel with Rowan's label on it was the strongest object in 2 years. Forensics pulled fragments from it, metadata that survived in a stubborn little corner of memory. It showed a brief burst of motion data, then stillness. It showed the last recorded location drifting near the cut. It showed Caleb's final unsent draft message, typed and never delivered. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't a goodbye. It was half a sentence, chopped by whatever happened in the tunnel. Rowan read it and broke in a quiet way, like a person collapsing inward. Elise read it and went pale, because she could hear Caleb's voice in those words. He'd been trying to leave a breadcrumb. He'd been awake. He'd been fighting for proof. The investigation widened. Darren Merritt, the contractor, finally surfaced, not because he wanted to, but because someone in the contracting chain got nervous and quietly pointed Lila toward an out-of-state address where Darren had been living under a different surname. Lila went there with a warrant. Darren didn't look like a criminal mastermind. He looked like a tired man who'd spent years running from a choice he couldn't undo. He denied everything at first. Then he saw the evidence photos from the chamber, and his face changed. His mouth tightened. His hands shook. He didn't confess in a clean movie way. He offered fragments, excuses, self-justifications. He said he was hired to do special access work. He said the rail company had weird old infrastructure, and sometimes they needed a contractor who didn't ask questions. He said Troy paid him extra for off-schedule tasks. He said he thought it was just theft at first, moving stolen equipment through hidden corridors. Then he said something that made Lila go cold. He said the first time he realized it wasn't theft, it was too late. He said he saw someone being pushed, not guided, someone resisting, not confused, someone holding a phone like it was a weapon they didn't know how to use. He said he told Troy it was wrong. He said Troy told him to forget what he saw. Darren said he tried to walk away after that. He tried to quit. He said Troy reminded him calmly that contractors were easy to ruin, that one anonymous report could destroy his ability to get work, that he'd already been paid in ways that would look suspicious if anyone looked, that his fingerprints, his badge logs, his access records, those could be turned against him. Darren said he believed him. Fear makes people obedient. Darren also said he didn't know what happened to Caleb afterward. He swore he didn't. He said once a person was moved into the hidden passage, he wasn't part of the next step. He said there were others, people who didn't wear safety vests, people who came and went quickly, people Troy treated with unusual deference. He said they weren't rail. That phrase, simple as it was, suggested a bigger shape. The case became heavier than a missing commuter. It became organized wrongdoing using public infrastructure as a tool. The city demanded answers. The rail company's leadership panicked. Lawyers appeared like flies. Press conferences were scheduled. Statements were written in careful language that avoided admitting what everyone could now smell. Rowan watched it unfold and felt a bitter irony. For 2 years, she'd been told to be patient. For 2 years, she'd been told it was complicated. For 2 years, she'd been treated like a woman with a sad story. Now suddenly the system moved quickly because the system was scared. Troy Gann was arrested, not for Caleb specifically at first, but for corruption, falsifying maintenance records, misuse of access credentials, obstruction. The chamber made it impossible to claim innocence. The hidden passage was sealed under strict guard. Forensic teams combed it for traces, looking for anything. Fibers, prints, residue that might point to where people were taken. They found small things, enough to confirm that the chamber had been used more than once. They also found an old transit map with a route line marked in pen, and beside it a note in a handwriting different from Darren's, different from Troy's. Between stops, quiet window. The phrase had the cold efficiency of a plan. Lila kept pushing, because for Rowan, for Elise, for Caleb, corruption wasn't the point. The point was the person. Where did he go? The trail did not lead neatly to a single door opening. It led to a web of contractors, private security, off-book vehicles, and phone numbers that went dead when called. It led to places under the city that weren't on public maps: service corridors, drainage channels, storage areas left from older construction. It led to the uncomfortable truth that a modern city has hidden space, and hidden space attracts hidden use. But the case did produce one more thing: a maintenance camera from an adjacent industrial building, one that looked over the cut by accident, had archived footage for insurance reasons. For years it sat unreviewed because nobody thought to ask a warehouse owner about a camera pointed at ugly trackside walls. Lila asked. The owner provided it. The footage was grainy. The angle was poor. But it showed the cut on that morning. It showed a van parked briefly in an alley behind the fence line. It showed two figures near the service door. It showed a third figure arrive, someone who moved with the confidence of familiarity. It showed, for a moment, a hand raised as if signaling, now. The camera did not show Caleb's face clearly. It did not show violence. It did not show the inside of the tunnel, but it showed something that made Rowan's breath catch when Lila described it later. It showed a backpack being set down on the train side of the corridor near the door, placed neatly, not dropped, and then the figures moved. The van pulled away. The city, of course, wanted a clean ending. People always do. They want a body found, or a survivor rescued, or a confession that ties everything up in a knot you can hold. The truth was messier. The investigation proved the method existed. It proved access was misused. It proved Troy and Darren were involved, and it pointed toward a larger group. But Caleb's location remained unknown. Rowan hated that. She hated it in a way that made her feel like she was boiling from the inside. She could accept grief, maybe if grief came with certainty. She could accept loss, if loss came with truth. But uncertainty is a slow poison. Elise, quieter, held onto a different detail. Caleb's unsent draft. In the tunnel. It was not a goodbye. It was not surrender. It was proof Caleb had been trying to be found. Lila promised them only what she could ethically promise. She would keep looking. She also did something that good detectives do when they know the public story is about to fade again. She made the gray run impossible to ignore. She filed official documentation of the hidden passage. She forced it into the rail company's records. She forced safety inspections. She forced oversight. She forced cameras to be installed, not just at stations, but in the parts between stops people never thought about. The rail company hated it. The city quietly thanked her. Rowan returned to the cut once, after the news cycle moved on. She stood near the service door behind the fence line and looked at the ugly wall where her brother's life had bent into a mystery. The place looked smaller than it had in her mind, less haunted, more ordinary. That was the worst part. You want evil to look like something. You want it to have a face, a costume, a soundtrack. Instead, it looked like a dull metal door with a warning sign most people never read. Rowan thought about all the mornings she and Caleb had ridden trains without thinking. She thought about everyone on the North Line right now, scrolling and sipping coffee, assuming the world between stops was just empty track. She wanted to scream at them, not because she blamed them, but because she envied them. Ignorance can feel like safety until the moment it doesn't. The last time Lila spoke to Rowan that year, she didn't offer comfort. She offered a truth that was both thin and sharp. She said, "Now we know where the city has blind spots." Rowan asked if that mattered. Lila said it mattered because blind spots only stay blind if nobody forces the light. And because of Caleb, the light was finally there. Between stops, the city had been quiet. Now it wasn't. And somewhere, whether in paperwork, in hidden corridors, in a person's guilty memory, Caleb's story had become too heavy to bury again.